Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, the Prime Minister is chairing a meeting of her Cabinet Subcommittee on Brexit today, where ministers will discuss the UK's future relationship with the EU. But over in Brussels, the foreign ministers of the remaining 27 EU countries are meeting to mark an important point in the Brexit process, as they finalise their negotiating stance on the transition period immediately after Brexit. Also referred to as the implementation phase, it's the period of a few years after we leave in March next year. So let's look at the key issues that will be up for negotiation. So how long will the transition last? Well, the UK has said about 2 years, and the EU has suggested December 2020. The EU wants the UK to honour all free trade agreements and other arrangements between the EU and other countries. It doesn't want the UK to sign any deals of its own, although the UK says it can negotiate and even sign deals to come into effect after transition. The EU wants freedom of movement to continue as before, but the government is planning to introduce a registration system for EU citizens coming to live in the UK during the transition. The EU wants the UK to comply with all EU laws and regulations during transition, including any changes made without UK approval. But the government wants a new mechanism to vet any disagreements over rules brought in during the transition. Adam Fleming is in Brussels and can tell us more. Adam, welcome back to the programme. So what should we expect?
Hi, Joe. Well, what we should expect in the next few minutes is European affairs ministers from the 27 remaining EU countries arriving on the red carpet. I've just seen the Austrian representative, the Danish and the Bulgarian, and so they'll stop, and it's an opportunity for us to ask them questions about the Brexit process, what they think about shenanigans in the UK at the moment. Then they'll sit down for their meeting, and at around 3:30 this afternoon they will publish their negotiating directives, which is a document a few pages long, setting out their position on this transition period, which the British government prefers to call it implementation phase. Then we're going to get a press conference, we think, with Michel Barnier, our old friend, the EU's chief negotiator, who we've not heard from for a little while, and then he's got the green light to start talking formally with the British government about actually getting the details of this transition or implementation phase nailed down. And of course the British government would like there to be a big political agreement about the transition terms by the time of the next summit of EU leaders, which will be on the 23rd of March.
Any signs of agreement so far between the two sides broadly on the transition?
Well, the British government's view and the view of British officials is that these transition guidelines have been drawn up as a result of a request from the UK and the speech that the Prime Minister made in Florence, where she said she wanted access to each other's markets to continue on current terms. So the UK spin, if you like, is that these are guidelines and directives that have been drawn up with the UK in mind. The EU side say, well, this is what we're offering you, this is the only way it can be done, with the UK sticking to all the rules and all the obligations that basically come with EU membership without being a member of the EU. I think the big thing that will have to be agreed between the two sides in the next few weeks, though, is this process for dealing with issues of mutual interest. So, for example, the fishing quotas, which will have to be set for the year 2020 at a meeting of fisheries ministers here in Brussels in December 2019. Now, the UK will be bound by those fishing quotas, but they won't have a seat at the table, technically. So a way will have to be found for them to have an ear to the door or stand by the table rather than having a seat at the table, whatever metaphor you want to use, so that that issue of mutual interest can still be sorted out by the two sides.
Adam Fleming, thank you very much. Well, let's speak now to the Belgian MEP Philippe Lambert. He's a member of the European Parliament's Brexit Steering Group, and he's in Brussels. Hello, Philippe Lambert. In your mind, how long do you think the transition period or implementation phase will be?
Well, I know that both the UK and the European Union want this to be short, around about 2 years, but frankly speaking, I wouldn't bet too much money on this because, well, when you look at the at the number of things that have to be negotiated during the transition period for a deal to be finalized in that period, well, I guess that you will need much more time than the anticipated 2 years. So we should not be too ideological about that, unless, of course, some resent the fact that the only way for the UK to keep full access to the European single market in the meantime means abiding by the EU regulation, and that's true. It means a number of obligations for the UK, but also a number of rights during the transition period. Basically, the United Kingdom would be in a quasi-member state situation in the transition period, except that it would not sit at the table where decisions are being made. And I understand that this is seen as a not very comfortable position, but then again, you need time to finalize the future relationship.
Yeah, does that mean that quasi sort of status, as you say, in terms of membership? Would you expect the UK to still contribute to the EU budget if it were to be longer than 2 years, the transition period?
Yes, that's part of the equation. And by the way, in her Florence speech, Theresa May already conceded that during the transition, the United Kingdom would contribute in order to secure access to the single market. Now, my honest assessment of the situation of the commitment made in December not to have any border in Ireland and not any border in the Irish Sea might mean that ultimately the United Kingdom would stay fully in the single market and customs union. But of course, that is what negotiation will tell us.
Right, and in that negotiation, would you accept the fact that freedom of movement would change even during the transition period if the UK is developing its own registration system, that would be negotiated as part of the implementation phase?
There, I must say, I don't believe so. There's quite a large degree of unanimity on the EU27 side that while the UK remains fully into a single market and customs union, all the obligations that come with it, including freedom of circulation of people, stand, and therefore there's not really wiggle room there. There's a lot of wiggle room afterwards for the future relationship, but not during the transition period.
All right, and what about in terms of the rules that you say Britain would be under the jurisdiction of the rules that are made, any new rules, in fact, made during a transition period? Would the UK, in your mind, should it be allowed to have input still in those rules that would then come over Britain?
Well, I'm not too ideological on that. Certainly, if Brexit has happened at the end of March 2019, no Brit will sit in the European Parliament, in the European Commission College and in the European Council. Yet, I think that it would make sense that we receive non-binding opinions by the British government. You know, sometimes there are very good ideas coming out of London and we should heed them if they make sense. I've always rejoiced at many contributions that the British government has been making, and I won't change my mind afterwards. Now, the key point is that, well, it can be advice, it can be requests, but they can't be binding on the 27th.
Right. Do you, I mean, you speak for the Parliament, obviously, as an MEP. Your views that you've just reflected there on a number of issues, is that also, do you think, the opinions of the leaders of the countries represented by the Council?
Well, I would guess so. Except maybe on the duration of the transition, I am less adamant than some on this. Some say, well, you know, we can't have a longer transition because the current multi-annual budgetary framework expires in 2020, and it would be a bit cumbersome to draw the next multi-annual budget without the UK, but with it. I mean, taking into account the British contribution to it or not, frankly speaking, to me, it's a non-issue. I mean, if the transition has to be longer, it has to be longer because a cliff edge would be bad for both the EU27 and the United Kingdom. Okay. And therefore, if we need a longer transition period, fine by me. But I know that some have a more ideological view about that.
Philip Lambert, just a moment. I'm going to bring in a guest in the studio, a Tory MP, Bim Afalami, and I'll come back to you in just a moment. What's your reaction to a longer transition period if necessary? And actually Philip Lambert says he probably thinks it will be. No alternative immigration or registration system during the transition. And yes, we would have to take all new rules that come into play while we are still in this quasi-membership role.
Well, I think the most interesting thing that the gentleman said was that he was quite flexible and he thought other EU states would be flexible
not around on all those issues.
around Britain having a say in certain rules that would apply to us during the transition period. That is really important, but I don't think we should be too ideological about this. We need to make sure that as we leave the European Union, we get it right. And if getting it right means that in the process of those 2 years, we have to, you know, accept things that we otherwise won't accept after that period, then we have to do so, because I think it's important that when we leave, we do it on the right terms in the right way.
And you'd be happy to see transition go beyond December 2020 or March 2021?
No, I think that when you agree an 18-month or 2-year, whatever the time period is, we've got to stick to that. That's very important.
Why?
Well,
I mean,
because
it almost says it won't be achievable.
Well, I think a lot of people said lots of things haven't been achievable in this process, and they've been achieved. What's important is we set the date, we work towards that 2-year or 18-month, however long it is, period, and we get it done by then.
Philip Lambert, it's now evident that the UK wouldn't be the only country to vote to leave the EU in an in-out referendum. You no doubt heard the French president revealing that he believes voters in France would do the same if given the choice. Hardly a vote of confidence in the European Union, is it?
Well, I do not share that view. What I witness on the ground, and not just in my home country, is that, yes, there is resentment about many policies carried out at European level, but no, there's not, that resentment doesn't translate into a will to leave. In other terms, I think that the vast majority of our citizens want to change the set of policies that are carried out at European level. Look at the level of inequality that we have, for instance. People resent that, and the EU is often seen as a vehicle of those inequality policies. Well, we need to change that. But you know, it's not by chance that Marine Le Pen lost in the French campaign. It's not by chance that the populists across Europe are toning down their Eurosceptical rhetoric.
But Emmanuel Macron thought even so that actually French voters would vote to leave if given an in-out referendum.
Well, I mean, his opinion is worse than anyone else's, so I don't share that opinion.
Right. I mean, is it the case, then, in your mind, that the EU does have to show it's being very tough on Britain to deter any other member states deciding to hold an in-out referendum?
No, I think that is bad policy. I mean, keeping people together by scaremongering is not a good policy. So we should be fair in our dealings with the UK, and indeed, membership comes with benefits and with obligations. And lack of membership comes with benefits and with negatives as well. So we do not have to make the situation worse than it is, because I do believe that for the UK, being out of the single market and customs union and being out of many cooperations with the European Union is not a good place to be in. And I think people will realize that without us being forced to darken the picture. I think it's not good policies. We should keep an open hand and again, well, an extended hand. And again, to me, on the issue of the UK having a say, I want to be very precise.
All right.
That the UK can contribute opinions, fine, but it cannot have a voice in the decision.
Right.
So the decision is for the 27 to make.
Philip Lambert, thank you very much. That then slightly clarifies. They could have a voice at the table, but it wouldn't be binding. They really wouldn't have a decisive say at the table on rules from the European Court of Justice. Would you accept that?
Well, I think we've got to wait and see what the negotiation turns up. He is making a point from the EU's perspective. Obviously, the British government view currently is different, and we'll see where we get to.
Right.
Do you agree with Jacob Rees-Mogg, Bernard Jenkin and other Eurosceptics in the Conservative Party that Philip Hammond is a block to Brexit and should be sacked?
No, I don't agree with that. I think that's wrong. And I think that Philip Hammond, along with the other cabinet ministers who I've spoken to about this and other issues, are working very hard with the Prime Minister to get the best deal we can.
Kat, on the idea and issue of a second referendum, Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, has said that isn't going to happen. Do you agree with him when there are so many Labour Party members, the vast majority, who would like to see a second referendum and a vote on the deal?
I do agree with Jeremy. I campaigned to remain in the referendum, but I was very clear when I was campaigning that this was the referendum that would decide. And unfortunately, from my point of view, of course, I was on the losing side in that referendum. But I respect the outcome of it. And now we have to deliver. But there should be a binding vote in Parliament on the final deal. And that was something that the Labour Party called for and we're hoping to achieve.
And what sort of customs union does Labour want to see with the EU?
Well, it's obvious that the EU 27 are some of our closest, geographically closest neighbours that we want to continue trading with. So therefore, it makes sense to be in a customs union. And that, to be
How
honest,
would that
is
work?
open to negotiations. I mean, this is a long way off now, and the negotiations are to be had on that. But it's important that business in Britain can trade with the EU 27 countries.
Right, so you've got the same position then with the Conservative Party on that?
No, I think that the direction of travel that we're seeing from David Davis and from Theresa May right now, I think is chaotic. I think that, given that it's what now nearly 2 years since we had this referendum, to have only got this far, I think is quite irresponsible on the part of the government.
But we don't know your end state either at the moment. I mean, you say it's chaotic. That may be the process. But in terms of what you're offering voters, in terms of where you would be with the Brexit negotiations, what is the difference in terms of the close alignment with the EU that some are saying within the government and what you're offering?
Well, we don't want to see a Brexit deal that will damage jobs in the British economy or reduce environmental protections or workers' rights. And I think that the difference between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party probably rests mostly on that, because there are a lot of Tory Brexiteers who want to rip up employment rights and want to shred environmental protections.
Well, Bim, is that what you're doing? I mean, is there any risk of that happening?
Well, that's just rubbish and wrong. In relation to the Labour Party, their position is chaotic. You've had front benchers saying, like Barry Gardiner saying, they're definitely going to leave the customs union. You've had Diane Abbott saying they want to have a second referendum. You've had others saying that they should stay in the customs union. You've now had Carte saying that there should be a customs union. I don't know what it is. I can't think what voters out there think.
But they're not the government, are they, at the moment? They're not the ones in the negotiations. So can you reassure viewers that there wouldn't be any ripping up of workers' rights or employment rights, that jobs wouldn't be under threat?
Well, no, the government has never said, not once, that we want to get rid of employment rights or get rid of environmental protections. I mean, this is just completely wrong, and it's frankly scaremongering from the Labour Party for political reasons, and I don't think that is helping this country or anybody get the best deal with the European Union.
I think it's really clear that there are Tory backbenchers who do want to see that kind of Brexit. And what we're seeing, and I hope I'm not veering into another story here, right, but with Theresa May, as weak as she is as Prime Minister, is under immense pressure from these backbenchers to do these things about ripping up workers' rights and environmental protections.
Right. Do you see, Bim Afellami, Britain is at risk of becoming a vassal state? That this idea of remaining in the European Union in all but name is now a real prospect, certainly during the transition and possibly beyond?
Well, we talked about the transition, as I accept that during a transition that, we will have to accept certain European rules that we won't have to afterwards. But more generally, the government's been very clear from the beginning that we're going to leave the single market and leave the customs union with the European Union. I don't quite know how that makes us a vassal state.
Right. And in terms of modest changes that Philip Hammond talked about, were you worried about that?
No, I mean, I have to be honest, I haven't seen his speech, so I should probably go and check exactly the detail of what he said.
All right.
March 2019 is when we are set to leave the European Union, but today the 27 remaining member states said that the United Kingdom must continue to obey the EU rulebook for almost 2 more years during the transition period. Brussels said Britain must stick to EU rules, even though it won't have any voting rights after next March. It also wants EU citizens to be able to continue to settle in the UK as they can now, and that will be the case until the 31st of December 2020, when the transition period ends. A spokesman for the Prime Minister said that while there was broad agreement, there were differences on specific details. Here's our Europe editor, Katia Adler.
Brexit is back on the Brussels agenda after a long-ish winter break. Today, ministers from the 27 EU countries came here to agree guidelines for the transition phase to follow immediately after Brexit. Aware of political volatility back in London,
do you worry about the fragility of the UK government?
Though clearly not keen to talk about it. The ministers are only giving themselves 10 minutes in there to agree EU guidelines for transition negotiations. It's a very public display of EU unity. In stark contrast, they know to what's going on in the UK. Still speaking today to a House of Lords committee, the Brexit secretary appeared relaxed about the transition period, at least.
It's pretty clear. We want a high degree of stability. We want the right to do deals outside. Broadly, that's it. And we want some control over our own destiny in terms of any subsequent legislation. It's pretty simple, really.
But is it? Mr. Davis was speaking in London at the same time as his European counterpart took to the podium in Brussels. And he made it plain that the transition period would transfer the UK from rule maker to rule taker.
During the transition period, if decisions are taken by the EU27, which are not acceptable to the United Kingdom, what action can the UK government take?
The UK asked for this transition period, giving it full access to the single market to provide stability for business. We're agreeing to that, but to benefit from the single market, the UK has to accept our rules. Single market à la carte is just not possible.
Mr. Barnier said the UK would have to respect rulings by the European Court of Justice and would not be allowed to enter into new trade deals with other countries. Here are some more possible flashpoints. Duration. The EU says the transition should last a total of 21 months. The UK may want more time. Freedom of movement. Brussels insists EU citizens have the right to move to the UK and apply for permanent residency throughout the transition period. Observer status. The UK will have to pay into the EU budget during transition and observe all EU regulations, though it will no longer be a decision maker. In all the fraught Brexit negotiations, this was supposed to be the easy part. After all, the UK requested a transition period from the EU. So the warning here now is if talks get too tricky over transition, that could eat into the precious time left under EU law to discuss EU-UK future trade relations before the UK leaves the bloc in March 2019. Once again, during this Brexit process, Brussels says the ball is now in the UK's court. Carte, BBC News, Brussels.
Meanwhile, in Westminster, there have been continuing questions about Theresa May's leadership and her handling of Brexit. One Conservative MP today said the time for her to assert her authority was running out. Others have called for the party to unite behind the Prime Minister. Our political editor, Laura Kunsberg, is in Westminster for us tonight. Just how much pressure is she under here?
Well, she is under a lot of pressure, Sophie, no question about that. There's been a lot of grumpiness on the Tory backbenches and a lot of strong language flying around, with people, former ministers, talking quite openly about Theresa May's leadership. Nobody calling for her to go right now. But certainly some Brexiteers putting the idea on the table that she's going to have to do things their way if they are to continue to back her. But in a sense, you know, transition is providing this latest flashpoint in the long-running saga of Tory divisions over Brexit. Yes, there are some differences between the EU's position and the UK's government and the UK's government's position over how they manage the 2 years after we leave the European Union in March 2019. But it has again exposed the real divisions on the Tory benches over this. Some Tory backbenchers and many voters may feel if in the 2 years after Brexit Day not very much changes, much of the status quo remains the same and we have no say over the rules, what then was really the point of the referendum and choosing to leave? On the flip side, for Tory Remainers and for many people in government, that period is vital so that business isn't suddenly cut off from its biggest market overnight, so that people have time to get used to the world outside the European Union. But these divisions are not going away. The divisions in the Tory party, if anything, are intensifying. And there is a real demand now for the Prime Minister to be clearer about what she wants, not just over transition, but over the long-term deal as well.
Laura Kunsberg in Westminster, thank you.
Now, the EU's chief Brexit negotiator has said Britain will need to follow any new rules made during the transition period without having a say in how they're made or what they contain. Michel Barnier's comments come as criticism of Theresa May's government continues to bubble away, with one of her own backbench MPs warning today that the window is closing on her leadership. Our political correspondent Michael Crick reports.
Theresa May came back to the back of Downing Street this morning with EU leaders and Tory MPs alike calling for her to clarify Britain's position on Europe, and talk that without such clarity, the PM might soon be toppled.
Is this government bold enough to survive? Will this government ever agree on a Brexit strategy?
The Cabinet's Brexit committee met today amid reports that approaching 48 disgruntled MPs may have written letters to the chairman of the backbench 1922 committee.
Is there mutiny in the air?
48 would trigger a confidence vote in Mrs May.
Is there mutiny in the air?
Do you think Theresa May can survive?
Absolutely. She is not having any problems. I do not understand why this happens every week, and I've actually stopped reading the papers.
What about all these letters?
Well, people talk about letters, but no one actually knows how many there are. I'm on the 1920s.
There's a rumour there's 44.
I think that people are getting overexcited and will be very disappointed, the people who are trying to destabilise the party.
In Brussels today, EU leaders took just 2 minutes to confirm their negotiating stance on the transition after Brexit. The same tough terms revealed by this programme last week. During transition, they say Britain will be excluded from all EU bodies, have to abide by the European Court and accept any new rules.
During transition, the UK will continue to take part in the single market, to take part to the customs unions and to all union policies. It will continue to have all the economic benefits. Therefore, it must also apply all the EU rules. The single market cannot be à la carte.
And the transition will end, they said, at the end of 2020, not the full 2 years Britain would like. But the Brexit secretary didn't seem that worried about new laws brought in during the transition on which Britain would have no say.
In this period, in 2019, the Parliament, again, a new Parliament, a new Commissioner, a new Commission. I don't actually think the work rate of the Commission is going to be quite as high, or indeed of the whole institutional structure, will be quite as high as it normally is. So I think it will take longer. So point number one is there's not going to be many of these.
But many Tory backbenchers fear Brexit in name only.
Will the Minister confirm that it is not the government's policy that we abide by BINO, Brexit in name only, that we will not move modestly apart, and that we are leaving the customs union, the single market and the European Union, and will have control of our borders?
This MP, tipped as a future leader, says the window is closing on Theresa May. It could all depend on the local elections.
We've got very close votes, very close councils that we must hold on to if we're going to continue a really exciting progressive programme of reform. So let's get through the May elections and then see where we are.
Charles Walker is deputy to Graham Brady, the man supposedly getting letters from Tory MPs. Could it not happen any moment? Graham Brady rings up Theresa May and says, sorry, I need to have an urgent meeting with you. Goes round and tells her, yeah, there are 48 letters.
But, I mean, Martians could land at any moment. We could find the moon is made of cheese. I mean, there's all this sort of imagination and excitement around politics. The fact of the matter is there's only one person who knows if there is indeed a letter, and that is Graham Brady.
Saying there are none?
I don't know. That's what I'm trying to say is I don't know. You, Michael, don't know. Nobody knows how many letters there are, if indeed there are any, besides Sir Graham Brady.
Well, it has to be said, there are still plenty of Tory MPs who'll say the last thing we need right now in the middle of the Brexit talks is a leadership election which could take months and perhaps resolve nothing. But I do think the mood amongst MPs has changed a bit in the last week or two. First, amongst the Brexit MPs, who until now have been pretty loyal to Mrs May, there's a growing nervousness that the government has perhaps conceded too much to Europe. And those fears have grown since Philip Hammond's remarks in Davos last week, when he said that the relationship between Britain and Europe will change only in a very modest way. Having said all that, I think that it's worth remembering there are things still going for Mrs May. First of all, remember, remarkably, that the Conservatives are still neck and neck with Labour in the polls. And second, despite all this talk of people writing letters to Graham Brady, it's still quite difficult to find Conservative MPs that actually admit publicly to having written one of those letters.
Michael, thanks very much. Well, in a moment, I'll be speaking to Peter Bone, who's a leading Brexiteer. But first, let's turn to Conservative MP Anna Soubry, a government minister under David Cameron from 2012 to 2016, and a prominent voice in the Remain camp on the Tory backbenches. Anna Soubry, the EU is insistent that the UK will have to accept EU laws during the transition period. The Brexiteers are never going to go for that, and why should they?
I don't know, you'd have to speak to them. Look, I think most of your viewers will be getting sick and tired of this whole thing. They're not interested in all this squabbling. I think people have accepted we're leaving the European Union and they now want us to get on with it and get the best deal. And you know, what I want, frankly, is I would put the entire cabinet in a room, lock them in it and tell them that they're not going to be allowed out until they have settled on a policy as to what our strategy is going to be.
But that's
this
exactly
is the sort of
what
certainty
Theresa
what
May...
British business and people want.
Well, and Theresa May isn't doing that, is she? So, I mean, she's not showing leadership, is she?
Well, I think actually she has shown leadership. I mean, I thought her Florence speech was a very good example of that. And of course, it was in the wake of us losing our majority. And we really do need to wake up and accept the reality of all of this, which is that we lost our majority in June. I think that that was because the British people did not want what they had been told was going to be a hard Brexit. And we are not, people don't want this thing called a hard Brexit. They want a deal that puts the British economy absolutely at its heart. It's exactly what the CBI was asking for just over a week ago. And you know, my party has traditionally been the party of business, and rightly so. And it's about time we listen to business, and if we do that, then we will be having a sensible Brexit. There are models that are available. EFTA is something that is gaining a lot of support, certainly across the Conservative benches. And the irony is that there is a consensus in the House of Commons, and I think in the country.
Well, you don't know whether
there's need to grab that consensus.
I just want to ask you another question. I mean, you don't know what the country thinks about hard Brexit, soft Brexit, but you've called the Brexiteers wreckers. Now, I want to put to you, isn't the Chancellor a wrecker for going for a modest Brexit? That's what the Brexiteers think.
Well, if that's what they think, that's up to them. I completely disagree when you say that about the Chancellor, but may I take you to your starting point of the question, that I don't know what people think in my own constituency. We've just been through a general election. I know exactly what people in my constituency want. They voted to leave the European Union. Very few actually have changed their minds on that. They certainly did not want, though, a hard Brexit, and I stood on a very clear platform in Broxtowe. I made it very clear I would continue to make the case for the single market and the customs union, and whilst my majority went down, I accept that. I won an extra 1,800 votes, and I take that as a mandate which I would expect in Britain, which is that people want a moderate, pragmatic, consensual, a consensus building on Brexit, and you can achieve that. And that is the irony. In Parliament here today, the majority of members of Parliament, I believe, if there was a free vote, would vote for the single market and the customs union, or at least a form of it.
Is the Prime Minister strong enough to lead the vision of Brexit that you want, or is her time running out?
Yes, I believe she is, and it's now the job of Cabinet to stop all this nonsense, you know, get some backbone in themselves, help her, and see off this small group of 35 people who represent nobody but themselves, see them off, bring our country together, bring Parliament together, form that consensus, and get the best deal for our country, which is achievable. And it's a form of the single market and the customs union. Don't care what labels you put on it, it's what it delivers that's most important.
You've made that point loud and clear. Anna Soubry, thank you very much for joining me. Well, let's turn now to Peter Bone, who is a leading Brexiteer and also MP for Wellingborough. I suspect he might have a very different story. Peter Bone, you've seen the EU transition plans. What do you think Number 10 should say to them?
Well, good evening, and it's 424 days till we come out of this dreadful European Union superstate. So whether we do a deal with the EU or not, we're coming out, and that's the main thing. And I'm absolutely 100% behind Theresa May and David Davis and what they're doing, and I hope we're going to get a free trade deal. If we don't, well, we can come out on WTO rules. So it's
and the current leadership, the current sort of weakness in Theresa May's leadership makes it rather more likely that there won't be a deal, doesn't it? And you're saying game on.
Well, I don't know why you come up with this weakness in the Prime Minister's leadership. So far with the Brexit negotiations, we've hit all our targets, and she's the sort of person that just gets on with it quietly and does the deals, and we move forward.
Do you see any vision coming from her, though?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's quite clear what's going to happen. We're going to have an implementation period of less than 2 years. We're going to come out of the EU on the 29th of March 2019. We're going to end free movement. We've got to stop sending billions and billions of pounds to the EU each year. We're going to make our own laws in our own country, judged by our own judges. And if Theresa May delivers that, she'll deliver what the British people voted for in the referendum.
Aren't you troubled by the CBI president saying that a company board wouldn't get away with this failure to set out a plan, this lack of detail that Theresa May is currently presiding over?
Well, that's rather an absurd statement from that. Weren't they the people who said we ought to go into the euro? And they were dreadfully wrong on that, I think. But the basic point is there is a plan. It's whether people like it or not, they're delivering on the plan. And I actually think there's two more hurdles. There's the end of March, when the implementation period has got to be agreed, and we've got to have the heads of agreement for the free trade agreement, and then in October, when the whole free trade agreement and everything needs to be agreed. As long as it doesn't matter, we're coming out in 424 days, whether the EU want to agree with us or not.
Something tells me you're keeping account on those days. Peter Bone, thank you very much for joining us.
Theresa May flies to China tomorrow on a trade mission seeking to secure the sort of deal the government's hoping to land after Brexit. It's possible she might never have been as happy to leave these green and pleasant lands after yet another weekend of torrid headlines and a growing chorus of criticism from across her party, not least from a band of Brexiteers who seem to feel distrustful of the Prime Minister's ability to deliver. Today, Europe's foreign ministers made a point of showing their unity on the issue by taking just 2 minutes to agree the hard-line terms on which negotiator Michel Barnier can approach the next round of Brexit talks.
The EU position is very clear. The transition will last for 21 months until the 31st of December 2020. During this limited period of time, the whole EU acquis will continue to apply to the UK.
Michel Barnier, so how does the state of Brexit talks affect Theresa May's leadership, despite the growing noise? Is there any sense anything's actually changed? Nick Watt is here. A little bit more movement tonight, Nick. What's your sense?
Well, a very interesting interview by Liam Fox, the International Trade Secretary, in The Sun tomorrow. And he's essentially saying to Brexiteers, guys, you're going to have to learn to live with disappointment because we, the Conservatives, do not command a majority in the House of Commons. But he says, look, the core Brexit is going to be delivered out of the single market, out of the customs union. But also in The Sun, there are 3 Remainers, Nick Soames, Robert Halfon and Nick Bowles, who are saying that the Prime Minister really needs to be setting out a vision, a domestic vision for Britain after Brexit. So look, what is going on? I think what is happening at the moment is that 2 forces are colliding. There's the legacy of that recent reshuffle, lots of resentful ex-ministers, and then you have Brexiteers who are thinking, is this Prime Minister just going a little too far in a soft Brexit direction?
But she's going to survive this, Nick.
Well, I'm reminded of what Harold Wilson said in 1969. You ask what's going on, I'm going on, this government is going on. For the moment, Theresa May is going on. And interestingly, I was talking to one former member of the government who says the quiet ones are still quiet. The noisy ones are noisy. Ian Duncan Smith was in trouble when the quiet ones stopped being quiet. But on the other hand, I have been talking to other Tories. I spoke to one former minister who said they believe that there will be a challenge, there should be a challenge against Theresa May in the summer to give a new leader a long time to bed in for the 2022 election. This person said to me, Theresa May, it really isn't working. And they say, you journalists, you've got the wrong end of the stick. You're looking for these 48 letters that you need to get that confidence vote. We're not after the 48. They're after the 159 votes you need to get to oust Theresa May in a confidence motion that would follow that.
Nick, before we go, quick word on Labour.
Yes, there's going to be an interesting new face on the Labour front bench when the EU withdrawal bill starts its long journey through the House of Lords. That is Lord Peter Goldsmith. Now, his evolving advice on the Iraq War as Tony Blair's Attorney General famously meant that that war, that military action, was authorised for those UK forces. Now, what's interesting about this is that the defining moment of Jeremy Corbyn's career was opposing the Iraq War. You could say maybe that's how he managed to bury New Labour in the 2015 leadership contest for the Labour Party. But he, of course, doesn't appoint the front bench in the House of Lords. That's Baroness Smith of Basildon, who's the Labour leader in the Lords. but I'm told that this is more of a guest on the front bench, not an actual front bencher, so Jeremy Corbyn is living with it.
Nick, thanks very much. Well, with us from Westminster, Nicky Morgan, former Education Secretary under David Cameron, and Jacob Rees-Mogg, who now leads the European Research Group of Tory Eurosceptics. Now, two backbenchers. I guess if there are grumblings or any sense of unease coming from both of you, then Theresa May is probably bang on, isn't she, doing something absolutely right? Nicky, let me start with you. Nick said, forget about the letters to Graham Brady. I mean, are you even hearing of anyone actually voicing their unhappiness in letter form at the moment, or is that complete tittle-tattle?
No, I'm not hearing of anybody. Nobody is going around saying we signed this or we sent this in, and I certainly haven't done that. And I think it's really important. I think what we're seeing now, the EU today talking about the negotiating stance. We've got a critical 9 months ahead of us, and I think everybody in the Conservative Party realises that we will be judged by the success or otherwise of these Brexit negotiations, the final deal that we get to. The Conservative Party has a strong reputation for economic competence. We must not jeopardise that in these Brexit negotiations, and all these noise off about the leadership really don't help.
Where do you think the instability is coming from then? I mean, when you hear Johnny Mercer, not a particularly natural rebel, saying the window's closing for the PM to meet the challenges, is he right to speak out? Is that an unhelpful intervention, or...?
Well, look, I think there are frustrations, inevitably, and I think that we're just hearing, I think some of my other colleagues are talking about a need for a real focus on domestic legislation. I think that we've seen with a focus on the environment, for example, recently, that it is possible to talk about things other than Brexit. I mean, you've just had a piece talking about PIP and about mental health. The Prime Minister is a passionate champion of better mental health care for everybody. We'd all like to be talking much more about that than we are about Europe. And of course,
well,
Brexit's
she got
important.
That one quite badly wrong, to be honest, didn't she?
Well, we've just been debating that, and obviously you've been discussing it and everything else. Actually, a very fast reaction from the government saying we're not going to appeal this. You know, this hasn't been handled right in the past. We're going to get it right now. But broadly, supporting people, for example, with mental health challenges, looking at the way the NHS is working, rising educational standards in our schools. We'd all like to be talking about those things. But Brexit's going to be central for the next 9 months. The point is that we can't all fall out with each other. That is not what the country needs.
So the way you're talking, Nicky, sorry for coming in, but the way you're talking, you are happy to see her fulfil her parliament for 5 years. You're happy then to believe that she has a game plan. She actually has a series of things that she is not just talking about, but doing. You believe that?
Well, I think that the Prime Minister, when she took over the Premiership and stood on the steps of Downing Street, laid out a very, a plan, a speech that we all thought was brilliant.
Is she doing, though?
There is action, but the honest truth is that trying to get much attention on anything other than Europe at the moment is really difficult. I think certainly the chair of the Treasury Select Committee, we know that things like the budget, things like productivity, things like what's happening in terms of growing our economy are incredibly important. But all of that, of course, the Brexit negotiations are going to be very influential in all of that. But it's really important that it's not just about the Prime Minister. There's a whole cabinet there, and if the PM is not the person who's going to be setting out a plan, then, as I've argued today, the Cabinet have got to do in their own areas and within the bounds of collective responsibility, they've got to agree an end state for Brexit. They've got to stick to those lines. Because actually everyone falling out with each other is really, it's not helpful, it's not the right thing for the country at this particular moment in our history.
Let me just turn to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Do you trust the PM has your best interests at heart, your party, your Brexit?
Oh, yes, of course I do. I completely trust the Prime Minister, and I actually agree with a lot of what Mrs Morgan was saying in relation to the need for unity and for the government to set out what its end state is going to be. That there may be bits of the end state that I don't like, there may be bits of the end state that Mrs Morgan doesn't like, but what we need to know is where they aim to get, and then we can have a proper discussion, rather than having the Chancellor saying one thing and the collective Cabinet view being another.
What is your group then in the Times splash tomorrow saying they give her a 50-50 chance? I mean, it doesn't sound like a ringing endorsement, does it?
Well, that's nothing to do with me. I haven't said that.
But you understand where they're coming from, or do you think you have dissent within your own
No, there are always people with different views in a party.
No, but this isn't within the party. This is actually within the group that you head, isn't it?
But the ERG doesn't have a single view. The one thing we are collectively supportive of is the Lancaster House speech and the manifesto, and we want to back the Prime Minister in implementing that. Whether individual members speculate on the party leadership or not is nothing to do with me.
Is your support for her qualified when you talk about on the basis of Lancaster House, on the basis of what she said? I mean, were you happy with what Michel Barnier had to say to the Prime Minister today? Will you continue to support her if she lets that transition deal go ahead?
The terms laid down today in the transition deal are very bullying from the European Union. They are very harsh terms. They would require us to continue to allow free movement of people, even when we'd left.
What most people expected, isn't it? That was what most people expected under Lancaster House.
We would take, for the first time since 1066, laws imposed on us by a foreign power without having any say over it ourselves. Now, that may be acceptable if we have a clear idea of what the end point is.
So you would put up for that for 2 years if you knew what was coming
afterwards? If we had any idea what's coming afterwards. But we hear talk that we might stay in a customs union rather than the customs union and not get the advantages of Brexit, that we may have a high degree of regulatory alignment, which means remaining an EU rule taker and not getting the benefit of removing tariffs and non-tariff barriers on food, clothing and footwear, 21% of the average household's economy, that would have the opportunity to make everybody in this country better off.
So
it's a really exciting opportunity if we grasp it.
It is qualified, though. Your support will remain qualified.
My support for the Prime Minister on a personal level as Prime Minister is absolute. It's unqualified. Of course, there are aspects of policy where I want to see the Prime Minister implement what she has already said. And as the Prime Minister is a very forthright and clear person, I expect she will implement the policy she's set out. Let
me just ask you about this story that's breaking in BuzzFeed announced. They have seen the impact of Brexit from the government's own analysis, EUX's analysis, cross-Whitehall briefing, they say, and under the government's own assessment, a comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU, UK growth would be 5% lower over the next 15 years. If there was a no-deal scenario and it was WTO rules, it would reduce by 8%. They say from what they have seen, the UK would be worse off outside the European Union under every scenario modelled in every part of the UK. Your response to that?
The key phrase is every scenario modelled, and it depends on the basis of the model. If they use the same type of gravity models that the Treasury used prior to Brexit, those were comprehensively wrong. It predicted an increase in unemployment just by voting to leave of 500 to 800,000.
So the government's own model might be completely wrong
on the basis of these gravity models. And the key there is the assumption of the tariffs you apply to goods coming into the EU. And I don't know about these models, but the ones done before the Brexit vote assumed we would apply the common external tariff to EU trade with the UK. And that sort of thing makes these models highly speculative and so far very inaccurate.
A quick word from you, Nicky Morgan, on that Brexit study. And do you think the Prime Minister will be there to see us through Brexit?
Yes, I think, as I say, it's too important to worry about leadership contests at this time. We've got to focus, because actually what those models do, and we can argue about the underlying basis and everything else, what they show is there is a risk, and this is why I wanted to remain, of Brexit on our economy. And at the end of the day, our constituents are not going to thank us, nor is the country, if we have weakened their economic security and their jobs and livelihoods as a result of our negotiations. That shows why this is so critical to make sure that we do not undermine our economy any more than we're already going to by actually leaving in the first place.
Thank you both very much. Thanks.
Thank you.